Yes, she said, her voice so soft she doubted he could hear her above the sound of the wind in the sails. Dante Damaso never failed to surprise her, and she wished he would stop because each new thing she learned about him made her love him more. How hard it was for a man like Dante to reveal his vulnerability, and yet he'd done it often over the course of the last few weeks. She wanted to suppress her feelings for him, but it got harder and harder with every moment spent in his company. Do you want to steer? He invited, quite deliberately changing the subject, and she was happy to let him. I don't know. I wouldn't want to sink your precious boat. Wimp, he taunted, and she narrowed her eyes in mock outrage. Ooh, you're going to pay for that one. She got up and walked over to the wheel on wobbly legs. It certainly wasn't very easy to walk on these boats. He grinned and stepped aside to let her take the wheel. The boat immediately listed to the side, and she squealed. He chuckled and stepped up behind her, caging her with his body when his hands dropped on top of hers on the wheel. As usual, he smelled absolutely divine, and as his scent wrapped around her, she could barely concentrate on his instructions. Got that? He asked, after a whole lot of gobbledygook that she hadn't been paying attention to, and stepped back. It was a sheer fluke that Cleo managed to keep the boat upright. And this time when she squealed, it was with excitement, and when she laughed, it was without guilt. They spent a delightful afternoon on the boat, and Dante took her to dinner at a Mexican restaurant afterward. Cleo enjoyed herself, and the evening was relaxing and stress-free. Their conversation centered around the hotel in Tokyo, the cute cards and paper flowers Cleo's dance class students had made for her, and Luke and Blue's ramshackle old house. He was sweet and conscientious, and the one little sour point in the evening was when he asked her if she wanted a glass of wine and she refused, forgetting that she was no longer pregnant. Then the memory had hit her like a ton of bricks, the pain fresh and intense. It was seeing the same flash of pain in Dante's eyes that helped her get over it, knowing that she wasn't the only one feeling the loss. Being with somebody who understood what she was going through helped immeasurably. On the drive home, he broached the subject of Zach again. What would you like to do with Zach's ashes? He asked quietly, and Cleo, who had been on the verge of dozing off after her 2 glasses of wine, was immediately wide awake. I haven't thought about it, she said. Cleo, we have to lay his soul to rest. We can't leave him in limbo like this. I'm not ready to think about it, she said stubbornly. Why did you name him Zach? Dante asked. I read on a few of the baby name websites that the name meant remembrance or something similar. And I just want him to be remembered. She swiped at a stray tear that slipped down her cheek. And what made you decide to add Damaso to his name? His voice was quiet and filled with an emotion she couldn't quite place. It would have been wrong not to, she said simply, and he kept his eyes glued on the road. Thank you. It means a lot to me. When he pulled into Luke's driveway, he turned to face her, his eyes gleaming in the darkness. Cleo, I know it's tough, and I want to do what's right for you. But I also want to do right by our son. I can't stand the thought of his ashes remaining there unclaimed. That is not how it should be. He was loved. I thought I could keep them until you're ready to make a decision, but they won't release the ashes to me. I've tried. Maybe, she started to say, and then hesitated, before swallowing loudly and plunging ahead. Maybe we should take him out on the Arabella and scatter his ashes at sea? It was so peaceful out there, so beautiful, and the view was lovely. I think it would be. And nice. He reached out with one hand, hooking the back of her neck and tugging her toward him to plant a gentle kiss on her lips. I think that's an amazing idea, he whispered, his own voice wobbling with emotion. Will you come with me to pick up his ashes tomorrow? Of course. Are you going to stay again? She asked, hating the edge of neediness in her voice. He ran his thumb over her cheekbone, his eyes gleaming in the dark interior of the car. Much as I'd love to. I don't think I can spend another day in your brother's too tight clothes or wear his nasty shoes again. I need a change of clothes, Dulzura. Would you like to come home with me instead? He asked gently. Most of your clothes are there, and I'm sure you'd prefer sleeping in your own bed, see? I can't, Dante, she whispered, and his hand moved to cup her cheek. That's okay. I can go and fetch a bag and return here later. She was tempted to say yes to that suggestion, but didn't think it would be fair to ask him to make the half-hour drive to his penthouse at the waterfront and back to Hout Bay again. I can't ask you to do an hour of unnecessary driving, she said regretfully. It's okay, you go home. I'll see you tomorrow. Picking up the ashes the following morning wasn't as much of an ordeal as Cleo expected. With Dante by her side, it was surprisingly easy. He took charge and was even thoughtful enough to bring a beautiful, ornate little urn along with him. They waited in an uncomfortable, sterile office while the worker took the urn away to transfer Zach's ashes into it. When he returned moments later, he handed it over with a sympathetic nod. I'm so sorry for your loss, he said somberly. Cleo couldn't contain the sob that escaped when she saw the urn and acknowledged what the contents were. Dante wrapped an arm around her and held her close, while the morgue worker discreetly left them alone. It's so stupid to be this sad about the loss of someone who never really lived, she said, her voice muffled by his chest. He lived, Dante said firmly. He lived inside you, and in a different way, he lived inside me. He lived in our hearts and in our heads. We saw him, we felt him. Don't ever say he never really lived, Cleo. He may not have had a life, but he lived. You know, for a guy who only ever said or did the wrong thing in the past, you're doing pretty great with the pep talks lately, she said, trying to sound a little more lighthearted even while she plucked a white handkerchief out of his breast pocket and blew her nose inelegantly. How do you always manage to say the right thing? In this instance, I'm not saying anything you don't already know. He stroked her hair back and kissed her sweetly. She was getting used to his kisses, and it scared her because one day he wouldn't be around to give her any more. She dreaded the inevitability of that day. They left the hospital hand in hand, Dante carrying Zach's ashes. When they reached the car, Cleo turned to him impulsively. Do you think we could do it today? Are you sure about that? He asked. Don't you want your brother and Blue to be there too? They've been amazing, but they don't understand, Dante. Not really. Don't you think you'll come to regret excluding them? She thought about that and then sighed. I don't know, she confessed miserably. Maybe I would. He squeezed her hand and lifted it to his mouth to plant a kiss on her knuckles. Let's do it properly, okay? Would you like me to take care of the arrangements? She hesitated at his question, feeling horrible about letting him bear the brunt of the responsibility, but he stared down at her with those infinitely patient eyes, and she found herself nodding. Do you want it to be a religious ceremony? No, something intimate but informal. Okay. I'll take care of it. Dante asked Cleo, Luke, and Blue to meet him at the waterfront by 7:30 the following evening. He was waiting beside his berthed yacht, dressed all in white. Cleo was wearing a simple white summer shift dress, and Blue and Luke had also respected Dante's request that they wear white. He helped them aboard and cast off after making sure everybody was comfortably seated. Naturally, Luke didn't remain down for long. He wandered over to pepper Dante with questions about the boat, and the two chatted amicably while Blue and Cleo sat down. You okay? Blue asked, taking her hand. It helps to have you and Luke here, she said honestly, grateful to Dante for persuading her to include them. Her eyes drifted over to the big, handsome man who was talking to her brother. He was wearing a pair of expensive dark sunglasses, effectively shielding his emotions from all of them. But she knew exactly how he was feeling today. It helps to have him here too, Cleo admitted, nodding toward where the two men stood. Dante was casually winding some thick rope around his elbow and thumb. I've known Dante for a few years now. He's visited the house on occasion for dinner or to hang out with Luke, Blue said unexpectedly. Yes? Cleo prompted, curious to hear where this was going. Yes, and he was. Blue shook her head. Very different from this guy. Cleo snorted, knowing exactly what Blue meant. Let me guess. Cleo held up a hand to stop Blue from saying more. He was bossy, arrogant, a little too self-assured. And a little too unconcerned with the world around him? Sounds about right, Blue said with a smile. I could never fault his friendship with Luke, though. Classic bromance if ever there was one. You don't expect them to have much in common, and yet they can talk for hours. I think that's one of the reasons Luke reacted so strongly to the news that Dante was your baby's father. It felt like a betrayal. His best friend had disrespected his sister, and his sister had robbed him of his best friend. Well, he doesn't have to worry about that anymore. After today, Dante and I will probably not be seeing much of each other again. She couldn't think of a single reason they should have any connection after this. Zach's remains were all that tied them together. Life would have to go back to normal, even if Cleo would never be the same. Why not? Blue asked. You guys are good for each other. We're helping each other get through this, Blue. After this, we have nothing tethering us to each other. We can move forward and carry on with our lives. Have you spoken to him about this? He'll agree with me. He has to. It makes no sense to drag this out when there's nothing more between us. The boat finally started moving, and Luke sat down on Cleo's other side and dropped an arm around her shoulder in casual affection. Giving her a comforting squeeze. It'll be okay, Patty Pan, he said beneath his breath, and she gave him a small smile. I know, she whispered, and dropped her head on his shoulder. She watched the waterfront slide by and get left behind, watched the beautiful flat-topped Table Mountain recede and become flatter and flatter the farther out they went. The view was breathtaking. Once they were far enough away from other boats to be alone, Dante switched off the engines. He didn't unfurl the sails but pulled a lever that he'd told her the other day was the anchor release. He stared off into the distance, the orange orb of the setting sun reflected in his sunglasses. He took a deep breath, and the lowered angle of his head told Cleo that he'd shifted his focus to her. He stepped away from the wheel and held out his hand to her, and she took it without hesitation, getting up to join him. Look at that, he said, pointing out at the horizon and the huge, shimmering globe of the sun as it sank silently into the ocean. He wrapped his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder and tugging her back until she could feel his hard warmth against her. His next words were spoken directly into her ear. I want you to always remember the beauty of this sunset when you think of Zach, Dulzura. Can you do that for me? Tears flooded into her eyes, and she gulped back a sob as she nodded mutely. Good. He seemed to silently communicate something to Luke, who got up and went into the cabin. He emerged moments later with the urn in his hands. He came up to stand on their left, while Blue moved to their right. Cleo, you have to be prepared, there's not much in there. He was so tiny. This time her sob couldn't be swallowed back, and he gave her a squeeze when he heard the sound. Are you ready? He asked as the sun disappeared completely, leaving only a bright orange and scarlet sky in its wake, making the ocean look like it was on fire. Yes. He released his hold on her and took the urn from Luke. We do this together? Okay? Okay, she whispered. Would you like to say something? Yes. Her response was so faint she wasn't sure if he heard her, so she straightened her shoulders and found her voice. Yes. She put her hands below his on the urn, and he adjusted his grip until his hands were on top of hers. When you're ready, he told her. You will, she began, but the words felt too big and obstructive to squeeze past her swollen vocal cords. She cleared her throat and tried again. You will always be in my heart, Zach. I will love and cherish you till the end of time. The last word was so badly mangled that it actually made her wince. Dante kissed her cheek sweetly and then returned his attention to the vessel in their hands. Te amo, Hijito. Te amo, he muttered, before lifting one of his hands from hers to take the lid off the urn and hand it to Luke. Once he had his hands over hers again, he looked at her, and this close to him she could see the faint quiver of his lips and, most tellingly, the line of moisture trickling down his cheek from behind his glasses. Okay? She asked him, recognizing that nobody had asked him that question since they'd boarded the boat. His lips quirked slightly in acknowledgement of her consideration, and he inclined his head. They both took a huge gulp of air, and together they upended the urn and watched as the meager contents poured into the water below. A minute portion was taken by the wind and scattered toward the distant city. Blue and Luke scattered white rose petals into the water to mix with the ashes, and they all watched as the petals drifted away from the boat. The ash, being heavier, sank almost immediately. Cleo felt hollow but at peace, grateful for the support of these three people who meant so much to her. And happy to have the opportunity to offer the same support to this man she loved with her entire being. They all silently watched the petals drift farther and farther away, and after half an hour, when it was almost completely dark, Dante started preparing to take them back to shore. As the boat started back up, the powerful purr of the engine shattered the silence around them, and Cleo felt a moment's panic at leaving. But as the boat stirred up water in its wake, something absolutely astonishing happened, and she cried out at the beauty of it. Dante left Luke at the helm and came leaping over at her startled cry, but he paused when they saw what had caught Cleo's attention. "It's so beautiful," Cleo whispered in awe. The stirred-up water in the wake of the boat was a sparkling electric blue, creating an otherworldly glowing path back to where they'd left Zach. It was perfect, and even though Cleo knew it was ocean phosphorescence, it couldn't have happened at a better time or had a more magical impact. She felt a strong and familiar arm creep around her shoulder, and she leaned into Dante as they both watched the shimmering wake stream behind them. "It looks like a path to heaven," she said, and then turned to look at him before hugging him fiercely. "Thank you for this, Dante. It's perfect. So beautiful." "My pleasure, Dulzura," he said, returning her hug. She took a deep breath and inhaled his wonderful scent one last time before stepping away from him. Chapter 15. Christmas would have been a lot grimmer if not for Blue and Luke inviting him over for the day. It had been almost 2 weeks since Cleo had simply upped and left with nothing but an unsatisfactory note of explanation for Dante. He was pissed off and worried about her. He couldn't understand why she'd just gone without a warning or goodbye. It had felt like a kick to the gut, especially since she'd flown out the day after they'd scattered Zach's ashes. Dante felt a little used and a lot hurt. Only Cleo had the ability to make him feel such contrary and powerful emotions. He, of course, knew exactly where she was, despite the fact that she'd kept that information from Luke and Blue just to avoid the possibility of them telling him. But all he'd really needed to know was that she was with Callum Ferris, and his resources had done the rest. He had known where she was since 2 days after she left. But he kept waiting for her to call. Only she never did. "Dante?" Blue's voice prompted him, her eyes concerned. "Do you want another slice of roast beef?" "No, thanks," he said, taking a sip of red wine. He'd been drinking way too much since she'd left, and he didn't want to become that guy. The fool who turned to alcohol whenever things didn't go his way. Still, it was damned satisfying to get rip-roaring drunk every night. At least he didn't have to face his cold and empty apartment sober. He was starting to hate that place more and more. Cleo had turned it into a home while she had lived there, and he resented not having that home anymore. He missed her companionship, those movie nights with those awful films she got such a kick out of making him watch. He longed for the dinners they'd shared and the conversations they'd had. He had loved cooking for her. Once his greatest passion, it had become a lackluster affair now that he prepared meals for only himself. And even though it had driven him crazy sometimes, he even missed tripping over the stuff she used to leave lying around the place. He couldn't bring himself to work out in his gym anymore and used the one at the office instead, because it physically hurt to stare at that dance floor and not see her doing her bar routines there. And crazy though it seemed, he even missed having her finish his sentences. "When did you hear last from Cleo?" he asked Luke, and watched his friend tense. "This morning. She called with Christmas greetings." "Is she alone today?" The thought of her being alone at Christmas bugged him. But then he told himself that she didn't have to be alone. She could be here with people who cared about her. Cal's there. They're attempting their own version of a roast lunch. Dante grimaced at that news. "They'll poison themselves," he grunted, shaking his head. "Especially if Cleo does the cooking." "Yeah, she's a pretty awful cook." "Is she happy?" Dante hated asking, but he needed to know. and Luke shifted uncomfortably in his seat. She's not unhappy, and for now I think that's all we can hope for. A month after leaving Cape Town, Cleo was starting to feel like she had a handle on her life again. Just a couple of days after arriving in Durban, she'd gone to a local dance studio and informed them they'd be idiots not to enlist her to teach a few ballet classes. Cal and a few of her former colleagues had vouched for her. She loved teaching and had fledgling dreams of opening her own dance school. She finally felt like she had a purpose again. She also choreographed dance pieces in her spare time, sometimes inspired by a song or a piece of art or even a bird in flight. It was wonderful and stimulating. She was developing quite a portfolio but didn't know if she would ever be brave enough to pitch those ideas to any dance companies. It was close to 5 in the evening, and she was just getting home to the apartment she shared with Cal after one of her new junior dance classes. She had her head down and was fumbling with her keys when she walked straight into something huge, warm, and solid just outside of the apartment door. "You really need to start looking where you're going," Dulzura chastised the last voice she had ever expected to hear again. She dropped her keys, her head flying up in reaction to that voice. She was filled with such raw, unbridled joy at the sight of him that her knees could barely hold her upright. "Well?" he prompted in that dulcet voice. "Do you have anything to say to me?" "What are you doing here?" she asked shakily. He snorted and shook his head in disgust before bending down to retrieve her keys. "I think the more accurate question is, what the hell are you doing here?" He unlocked the door and steered her inside before following her in and slamming the door behind them. "I live here," she replied defiantly. "No, you live with me," he gritted out. "You never moved out." "I seem to recall moving out after I lost our baby," she said pointedly. "That was always going to be a temporary thing." "How can you say that?" "I was only living there because I was pregnant." "Cleo, tell me what the hell happened." "We had Zach's memorial. We said goodbye at the waterfront. I told you I'd see you the next day, and you just left. How could you do that?" She had boarded the first plane out of Cape Town the next morning, telling Luke and Blue only that she would be living with Cal, but not telling them exactly where that was, because she didn't want to put them in the position of lying to Dante. They'd protested, of course, said that she was making a mistake, and begged her to stay for Christmas. But Cleo hadn't been able to face the holidays and had firmly believed that she needed to get out of the city and as far away from Dante as possible in order to cut him out of her life completely. "I left you a note," she reminded him, which said absolutely nothing. "Thank you for everything you've done. I cannot express how much it has meant to me, but I think we both deserve a fresh start." He sounded incredulous, but Cleo was more shocked that he could recite her note verbatim. What the hell was that supposed to mean? It meant exactly what it said, Dante. Everything that tied us together is gone, and there is no need for us to be in each other's lives anymore. Bullshit, he growled. There is every reason. I didn't want you to stick around because you felt guilty or whatever. I wanted you to go on with your life, and I tried to pick up the pieces of mine. It's for the best. There's just no reason for us to ever see each other again.